Hi everyone, this is Alan McKay. Welcome to episode 172. I'm speaking with Eran Dinur, a senior visual effects supervisor at Brainstorm Digital in New York City. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Alan McKay Podcast. Alan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Alan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Alan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on alanmckay.com.
Okay, welcome to a brand new episode. I'm really excited to introduce Eran Dinur, who is a senior VFX soup at Brainstorm Digital. He's worked at Framestore, a lot of other places, as well as published the book, The Filmmaker's Guide to Visual Effects. And I thought it'd be really fun to sit down and chat about Eran's past. I think it's really fascinating, his story about how he ended up in visual effects from a completely different industry and background altogether. So I'll leave it as a surprise as we get into this, but I found this to be a really rich and fun episode to go through and really to get to know Eran as we go through all of this. There's a lot of really great insights, and Eran shares a lot of really great knowledge. So I'm excited for this. A couple of things I was quickly mention is, as I record this, I actually just got some good news that the Avengers Endgame trailer just got released, as well as the poster for it, which I was involved in. So that was a lot of fun. Big shout out to Bond, who created the poster. I came on for 3 days to build out the whole ashing effect for it, which was a lot of fun to do. So it's kind of a fun experience where initially I got the call saying, hey, we've got this really cool job. It's through a friend of mine, Enrique, who's going to be on the podcast soon. And he's like, we can't tell you what it is, but it's going to be really epic. And we want you to come on board to work on it, but they wouldn't tell me what it was. And I nearly turned down the project. I was like, well, if you can't tell me about the project, I don't want to come in for 3 days to do a print job that was meant to make like God of War or anything else look like shame compared to what we were doing. So I rolled the dice coming in there. With even signing two or three NDAs, they still wouldn't tell me what the project was until I got there and we all went and saw Avengers, the opening night for Infinity War. And, basically I had like that weekend to kind of think about it all and come back Monday ready to rock and roll with what we're doing. And it's kind of funny because like Marvel came by like 5 hours after I started like wanting to see stuff. So it's definitely one of the tightest turnarounds. It was my first ever movie poster as well, and I'm really proud of my contributions to it. Having even just spent a little bit of time with the guys at Bond, it blew my mind how many people are involved scrutinizing the poster and how much time is spent. You got guys with a magnifying glass, like looking stuff over, for any imperfection. For I don't know, days at a time. I'm not sure. So it was really fascinating just kind of seeing like how many touch-up people and everyone else touched it. And for me, like my contributions were obviously doing all the destruction. I broke apart the whole logo and had it all breaking and doing all of that. And it was a lot of fun. It was totally a lot of fun getting to be a part of this. Now that being said, I'm hoping that we'll be doing an episode with the guys at Bond, at least the art director, Enrique. We've talked about doing an episode, and I'm going to be approaching the owners of the company later today about that as well. I think that could be a lot of fun just to kind of discuss this because it's a whole other aspect outside of visual effects. And it's a very interesting one because, again, when you see cool movie posters, it's always like, who did that? You never really get to hear about it. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun to discuss. I'm really excited for Avengers Endgame to come out. I believe it's April 26th. So I think this is going to be one epic film. And it was really fun to be able to contribute to the film in one way or another, especially such a high-profile marketing piece like this. So I'm hoping to get to see this on buses and everything else as things start to ramp up throughout 2019. Definitely check out Avengers Endgame when it comes out. In the meantime, this month I'm going to be putting out a lot of really cool content. We just wrapped up the Venom training, which was very massive. We had about 60,000 people going through that training all at once. And I love doing the crash course training because it's a chance for everyone to go through together. And that's one thing that I've had to talk about a bit in the past is like, why are you putting expiration dates on all this training? And for me, I find it really valuable if we're all doing it together with a deadline in mind, because otherwise, if there's new training put out, you bookmark it, you download it, it collects dust, it never actually gets done. But when you know that it's going away and is really valuable, it changes everything. It means that this is something that you're going to take seriously and you're going to push yourself to go through. And it means that everyone else is as well. So I love seeing all this work being shared and seeing the progress as well as everyone goes through it. That being said, one thing I'm really excited to announce later this month is that I have a lot of these crash courses that I've spent months preparing and building and created some really interesting content around the courses like Fireball, Decay, these Plasma. These all sound pretty ominous, but these are 10-hour free crash courses that I've put out in the past. And those are typically around for a week or two and then they go away. And whenever I've Googled myself, I'll say that, but I'm always curious what people are looking for. And it's funny because these become very strong keywords that people are looking for. They're looking for Alan McKay Venom, Alan McKay Plasma, whatever it might be. So a lot of these I'm actually going to be re-releasing as a commercial product later this month. So this will be the first time ever I'm doing this. So if you're interested in doing the Fireball crash course, which we go through creating a massive fireball, blasting through an aisle of a plane, ripping the chairs apart, blowing everything up. And that was actually an ode to some old course that I built about 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Yeah, about 15 years ago using Afterburn. But then another one creating a live action shot with a fully tracked human having his face like melting apart and like doing all the liquid and steam and all the digital makeup. There's a lot of really awesome stuff in there. And I'm excited to re-release this stuff because, again, it's so valuable. I do find and feel that this is the highest quality training out there. And I have been putting it all out for free during like a 1 or 2 week period. So what's going to happen is I'm going to be re-releasing this content for a pretty affordable price later this month. And if anything, again, I think that it just makes a bigger point that when I am putting out this content, you can either do it now for free or a year from now, 6 months from now, whatever it might be, you can buy it for a couple $100. And I think that's more incentive to want to take action and absorb it while you can. But of course, for those who want to access it later on, I really stand by the stuff and I want to make it accessible. There is going to be a couple of these that I'm going to be publishing on my website as well. So some of these will be commercially available and there'll be a few that I'm actually going to be putting on my website. So there's going to be a lot of new content coming to my website this month. And I'm hoping that that will become a ongoing trend. Most of my content, about 99% of it, is always just to those in my inner circle. So if you want to get access to all of that, go to alanmckay.com/inside and you'll be able to sign up there for free and get access to all of the content that I put out, because almost every single week I'm putting out content to those on the list, and it's a private list because I want to reward those who take action, and that's always how it's been. But I will be putting out some content for YouTube and a few other places like that more consistently now. One of the big ones that I'm really excited about, and this has been something I've wanted to do for the last couple of years, is visual effects case studies. So I just did one on Venom. It's going to go live in about a week. And what I'm doing is I'm going through the entire film, breaking down individual sequences and more discussing them from a visual effects supervisor's point of view about how to approach it, a lot of ways that either shots worked or maybe could have been improved, but more importantly how I would approach doing these shots with a team. So I think that that's going to be really interesting to go through. I've already gotten a lot of really great feedback from those who've privately seen it in my inner circle, but I'll be releasing it publicly very soon. And then from there I'm going to be doing another one on Infinity War. I think that'll be a really fun one to break down those sequences. It's going to be a big one because there's so much effects in that. It's almost an animated CG feature in a lot of ways. rather than a live action film. So that's going to be really fascinating. And then from there, provided you find this valuable, I'll be doing more of these as we go along. But I want to make that a regular thing on top of all of the other stuff that I'm doing. So I've got some really cool episodes coming out, a lot of really cool content. I'm excited. December is going to be a fun month. I got to fly to LA this weekend just for a day. Then I'm back Monday, and I'm going to be digging into a lot of new training and a lot of new projects. I've got a lot of fun things I'm looking forward to announcing very soon. But in the meantime, make sure to get on my inner circle. So like I said, alanmckay.com/inside, and you'll hear about a lot of that there, as well as a lot of exclusive free content that I share there as well. Finally, if you want to check out the show notes for this episode, everything that Eran and I discuss, as well as links to other resources, things like that, as well as his book, go to alanmckay.com/172 for episode 172. Okay, so that being said, let's dive in. Again, thanks for taking the time to chat. And Eran, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
So I'm a visual effects supervisor. I also teach at the School of Visual Arts. I've been doing courses at FX PhD, I think 6 or 7 already. And I also wrote a book that came out last year called The Filmmaker's Guide to Visual Effects.
That's awesome. I actually have it. I'm always obsessed because there isn't that many books out there. So whenever something comes out, I'm always just kind of curious. So it ends up on my bookshelf. But I haven't had a chance to dig into it yet. But yeah, I thought it was kind of funny because, yeah, I actually got that when it first came out. So that's awesome. And yeah, I was really curious. Like, we were just talking about this, but do you want to talk a little bit about how you first got started? Like, did you always think that you would work in film in one way or another? And, what were you doing early in your career?
Well, I'll start with my childhood.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when I was a kid, I loved music. I loved listening to music. And I think I also wrote some tunes, even though I didn't know how to write them down. And my dad used to write them down. And I also drew. And I usually drew orchestras. So I was drawing like a bassoon player or a tuba player. And when I look at these drawings now, I'm amazed because I don't think I would be... I can't possibly draw as well as I did when I was 5 years old. I can hardly draw a circle right now. So I think I had these two sides, maybe the visual and the auditory or the musician side. And, by the time I was 11, the music took over, and I studied music. I have a classical background. I studied musical composition here at the Juilliard School. Mm-hmm. I never finished my studies. I went back to Israel to serve in the army. That's obligatory, unfortunately. But over there, I was a keyboard player. And basically right after that, I had a career as a musician. And what I did mostly was write music for theater. And I was doing that for about 15 years. I had my career was going very well. I worked with all the major theaters in Israel and wrote music. And back then, if you would have told me that I would be a visual effects supervisor on films, I would laugh. I didn't even know what it meant. And I bought my first computer pretty late. I think it was the late 90s, like 98 or something, basically to use it in my recording studio, my home studio. Mm-hmm. And then, at night I would just go and download demos of different software. And one day I downloaded a demo of a software called TrueSpace, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was kind of like a more, an easy version of a 3D software. I think it was pretty nice. Yeah. I didn't know what it does. They had some demos there that showed something like with metaballs or something like that.
Yeah.
I got completely hooked. The moment I started playing with that, there was nothing else that was important anymore. And I can't explain it, but I think my old, visual side that kind of was turned off at age 5 or something suddenly came back. And also my love for like technical building things. And I really started teaching myself everything I could, modeling, texturing, lighting, animation, rigging. There weren't too many online tutorials back then, so I just bought tons of books, whatever I could get my hands on. And I kept working as a musician in theater. I remember myself sitting during shows on some of the theater shows that I wrote the music to. I also played piano or keyboards. And I was sitting in the back behind the audience on one of these shows with my keyboard, and there were downtime moments between cues, I had a Maya, learning Maya book open there. So I would play my cue and then read the next chapter, play a cue.
Wow.
So for some time I had this split personality. I didn't even know if I'll ever do it professionally. You know, it was, you know, fantasize about maybe being an animator somewhere. It really changed because I fell in love with a program called View,
Yep.
which is, you know, it's a 3D
Was
landscape.
it still
Yeah.
Vue d'Esprit? Oh, I can't say it properly because I'm Australian.
Yeah, Vue d'Esprit.
Yeah, I'm Australian.
Yeah.
We'll butcher everything. You know, the most elegant things out of an Australian's mouth will be like completely destroyed. But yeah,
Well, that's the reason, you know, they changed it to Vue.
exactly.
It was a free, that was designed by a French person called Nicolas Phelps, who's still a good friend of mine. And yeah, I just fell in love with it because I love nature photography, landscape photography. I love mountains. I love hiking in mountains. And it was just a way of suddenly creating, you know, your own vision. So I started just posting stuff that I did, and somehow I sort of got a name for myself as a Vue expert, or, you know, it got attention, and eventually Eon Software, the company that produced Vue, asked me if I want to work for them remotely from home to do renders for demos and do demo scenes and so forth. And I started doing that. And that was the point where I stopped working as a professional musician and started working as a professional CG person.
And just to jump into that for a second, but two questions: how old were you then? And I guess at the same time, like, for you to change careers at that point, like, you know, what was there a lot of hesitation or concerns, or was it very natural? Like, this is my calling. This is the next stage in my life.
Look, working for Eon Software was kind of a nice middle ground because I could still stay at home and like do it remotely. I think the big bang of switching careers came when ILM sent me a mail and asked me if I want to join their Singapore branch as an artist. And then suddenly it became clear that, you know, I'm switching profession. And it also, you know, by that time I was I was 40, I think. And I had a family. I had 2 kids. The youngest one was only a few months old. She was just born. And my wife was working in Israel. She was a lawyer. So obviously the whole change was more than just switching career. It was switching life. It was going away and living in Singapore.
Yep.
And it was a big decision, definitely. I just felt like, you know, there's an opportunity to do something that I really like, that I enjoy, that I could learn tons, and something about that just starting everything, you know, new was really enticing. I just couldn't resist it. And
Yeah.
I somehow dragged everyone with me, you know. We had a lot of conversations, me and my wife, and it was a decision. And then, you know, I got to ILM as a Vue expert. That's why they brought me in there. They actually used later on I realized that they used my demo scenes that came with Vue when they did the Pirates of the Caribbean, and they wanted to kind of learn what you can do with it. So they looked at my scenes. So that's how my name came up. They brought me in as a Vue artist, but there wasn't really any Vue work to do there at the time. You know, we started working on Ironman. So at first, you know, they didn't really know what to do with me. And then they said, oh, maybe you could be a compositor. And I said, why not? And, you know,
Sure.
I learned tons there. I was there 2 years, and it was like the best school I could have.
No, that's so cool.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was like, you know, the first review, you know, so with the supervisor, we're sitting there and the supervisor is talking about the blacks, and they're like, these blacks are, you need to fix the blacks. And I'm looking at them and thinking, well, they're black. What black is black. What's the, so, you know, I think the most important thing I learned there is to really use my eyes. And to train my eyes to really see things, and also the kind of meticulous, serious review of everything, and the level of quality. And I think I kept it with me wherever I went back there. But, you know, it was a weird switch. I was sitting there. There were times where I was sitting there, and most of the artists were like a lot younger than me. You know, I was the only one who already had kids. And sometimes I was asking myself, what am I doing here? Like, why am I here? I'm a musician. I was supposed to be on stage or in the theater. Like, what's going on? And then, my wife got accepted to the doctoral program at NYU for law.
Hmm.
And, we took another big decision to move to New York,
Right.
which wasn't like the most natural move for me because I saw myself by then as trained to do visual effects for movies. And New York is, predominantly commercials and design. So wasn't my first choice, but we came here and I worked for a while, different companies. I worked like half a year at Framestore,
Hmm.
and then landed at Brainstorm Digital, and as a senior compositor first, then as a compositing supervisor, and then pretty soon after that as their VFX supervisor. And I've been doing that for almost 8 years now.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny. I was talking to someone this weekend. I can't remember now, but yeah, I was talking about that. Like New York definitely has such a different culture, I feel, to most of the cities when it comes to visual effects. And it's there's so much work going through there, but obviously it's very heavy motion graphics, very heavy design. But it's also one of those places like I'm never surprised when, let's say, I'm visiting friends and I land there on a Saturday afternoon and I get like a phone call like, "Hey, I heard through so and so that you're in town. We have a project due in the morning. Are you available?" It's
Yeah.
like, yeah. So it's definitely kind of like whatever works to get the job done. But that's really cool. And I guess for you, I mean, you're right. Like there's such big shifts going from doing music composing to Singapore at ILM doing features over there, and then again New York being such a giant shift as well. I mean, I guess you could look back and blame True Space for being the domino that started this whole journey.
I can. I don't want to blame them. I mean, I don't want them to feel bad. But, look, I look back and I'm happy. I'm very happy I did it for different reasons. First of all, it paved the way out to live in different countries and see the world. If you know,
Mhm.
if you and I think music as a job is difficult, both financially and also because you're spilling out your guts for someone else.
Mm.
And it's not always easy because there's something inherently emotional about writing music. It comes from a place of emotion at the end, and it's hard to do that as a job. So but on the other hand, I got I because I worked with directors all this time and lighters and designers, set designers, I think I had something that a VFX supervisor really needs, is the ability to work with a director or someone who doesn't do your job and speaks in a different language than you, so to say, like speaks not in the VFX language, but in filmmaking language, and to be able to interpret what they want, what they need into your own language and pass it on to the artists. So I think in that sense, it was already easier to me to fall into the supervisor role, and I'm happy I did this change. It opened up an entire new world for me, and I wrote this book, which was also something that I really wanted to do for a while, and now I'm already planning my next book.
That's
Hopefully.
great.
Yeah.
Cool. No, that's awesome. And yeah, I used to date someone a long time ago who was studying music in NYU, and her and all of her colleagues all went off to do film scoring, pretty much all in LA. But it was kind of interesting because it was being kind of immersed in that world. It was a whole new world for me, seeing people scoring films and scoring projects in general, writing music, and yeah, like it. And also, you're right, like there for something that is such a beautiful. I don't want to say industry because that kind of takes away from it a little bit, but yeah, it's also one that you don't go and study to get rich. You're not going to go off and compose music and expect that.
Yeah, I don't think you do visual effects supervision to be rich either. I mean, if you want to reach, probably go to banking or something of that. Yeah, but it's interesting because you mentioned before we started this that a lot of VFX people who are connected to music, and I think there are lots of interesting similarities. And sound itself is like color in many ways, and we talk about sound in color terms, and there's a lot of similarities in the way when a musician listens to a piece of music or a song, they are able to separate the different instruments, the different ranges, and focus on only one instrument or one line. Whereas for normal or regular people who are not musically trained, it's usually very hard. You just get the overall experience. And I think us as visual effects artists and supervisors, we have the same way of looking at a shot or even an image and taking it apart.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing, feeling the light and the highlights and the colors and the how the shadows feel and looking at color that way. And I think color is probably the most important thing in visual effects, or anything visual, but it affects so much. Everything you do is basically color, lighting, distance, depth, everything is color. So I think that people who are or have a musical talent also have that they can view color the same way.
Mm-hmm. No,
it's theory. I don't.
No, again,
correct.
I like that observation because I mentioned this kind of briefly earlier too, but I have met a few people who there's a guy from Russia. I met him in Germany who he always swore that learning music because originally he was composing. He was composing music somewhere in Berlin, and he ended up changing careers quite drastically. Now he's a VFX supervisor.
Oh, wow.
But he always swore that for him, having studied music for the first part of his life, for him it changed everything. He could code as well as being an artist, and he swore that like everything that he had done, he could owe it back to music. That like it helped him structure everything that he does, and everything that he sees is always because of music. And that's what kind of, I think, planted that seed for me, the fascination with the correlation of music to all these other creative and technical fields is like, I guess learning to read music and write music and see everything that way, might change the perspective of how everyone sees it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, because again, I'm looking in from someone who doesn't understand any of that, and that's what fascinates me.
Yeah, I think I agree, and if I could advise anyone who's in visual arts to learn some music and vice versa, everyone who's in the music art to do some visual work, to paint, to draw, to take photographs, and there is a connection. I think there is a connection between among all art and but I wouldn't say it's the same with, say, writers who are also artists. They
Mm-hmm.
write books or something, but it's not exactly the same. I think music and sound and visuals go very much together. And I think, look, I still, if you tell me like, I still think of keys as colors. Like if you say D major, it has a certain color in my mind, and it's only that color.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there are a lot of people who have this with numbers. So we tend to associate, there is a technical word for it that I don't remember, but there is, we associate like sound and visuals together.
Well,
so
we are all visual people, so it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's just very helpful. I mean, I'm sure music helped me a lot because I never got any official training in visual arts. Nothing at all. I never went to a visual arts school, and it's funny because now I teach at a visual arts school. I never went to any. I never got any training and never did any courses. I'm basically self-taught. And I always feel that, I taught myself photography, and I like doing that a lot. I think this is super important for anyone who's doing visual effects, and especially, of course, supervisors, to understand, photography and to be able to feel photography in order to create photoreal work. But I always felt like it's a weak point that I never studied painting, a traditional painting or drawing. And so I think in a way, being a musician compensates for that in a way.
Okay.
Brought me some other skills.
And just going back to that, like, why do you think? I think I already know the answer to this, but like for you, why do you see it as a weak point, not having learned to paint?
Look, I mean, we as digital artists, we were a little lazy, I think, because we have all these amazing tools at our disposal. We can create things, build them, texture them, throw in the lights, render, and bingo, here we go. I just have to put the lights in the right place, give them the right amount of,
Exactly.
intensity and color, and the renderer is going to do it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are a traditional painter, if you're trying to paint something photoreal or close to real, you have to look at everything. I mean, your only tool is colors. With colors, you create lighting, you create highlights, you create shadows, you create depth, hazing, glows, lens flares, anything you want to create in a traditional way. You have to be able to do it without all these amazing tools that we have. So I think that if you have the ability to paint, or you learn painting, you already have the ability to look at the world in a very, very specific way, which is going to make you a better artist, better digital artist.
Yeah,
And this,
sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
no, this is something I try to pass on to my students, because we can get lazy, because we have all these tools for us to use.
Yeah, I think that I thought you might say something like that because again, I feel like photography is the same way that a lot of people because you have Control Z, because you have all these advantages over everything else, you tend to just throw things together and you're kind of looking externally at everything. But when you're learning photography, when you're learning to look through the viewfinder, through the lens, when you actually start to see everything from that perspective of the final product rather than this 360 freedom that we have, it changes everything because you start to see like, okay, well, where's my eye going? And that's one of the biggest things I find is when you're working with, like, let's say junior artists, is that they're just looking at whatever excites them in the image, and they're actually looking at, well, how do I control where someone's looking, and how do I prioritize like the order of, I want them to start at the top left, and I want them to identify this, and even prioritizing what's important to tackle, just because certain things they might get stuck on. When you're looking in the viewport, all these little things that are completely irrelevant. Like you spend half a day working on a shot on something that's behind a pillar, and you don't even really register it mentally. And I think that comes down to painting as well. It's like you're really having to think about perspective and composition, and of course color theory and all the other things that play into it. But I think that 3D especially, it's a little bit different because you have that total freedom. So it's not really from the result of the camera. And the more that you get your head into that, the more that you are thinking about the final result and how other people are going to interpret that.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I can add to it is that the fact that the way we see through our eyes and mind, it's not the way camera sees things. And everyone knows it. You go and you're on a trip and you see this amazing view with all the mountains, and you grab your camera and you just kind of, point and shoot. And then you're really disappointed because there's nothing of that grandeur and beauty and whatever you felt at that moment. It doesn't come out through the photograph. You're getting something, flat and overblown or whatever. Or, if you're inside an apartment during daytime and you want to shoot it and you see this nice well-lit apartment with, bright walls, and you can see outside, but when you shoot, the way a camera interprets exposure, it's either or. If you expose for the interior, a camera is it's cruel what it's doing. We compensate when we watch stuff. In our eyes, when we look at things, we fill in, we reduce the highlights, we fill in the shadows, we explain to ourselves subconsciously what we're seeing. But the camera doesn't do it. It just, you choose a certain exposure, and then some things will go totally blown out or too dark to be. So being able to understand how a camera sees the world allows you to create CG or do compositing in a way that looks photoreal. Not through the way we see things, because that's not how we expect to see things on the screen. When we watch a movie, we expect everything to look photoreal. And when you integrate an element into a footage, that element needs to feel like it was always there when the camera was shooting that shot, that it was part of the environment and was shot by the same camera. And part of the way of knowing how to treat elements and how to integrate them into shots is to think like a camera. And for that, you have to be, at least doing some photography or cinematography.
Agreed. Yeah, you definitely need to understand like the mechanics behind it, and yeah, I mean, understanding light. I mean, yeah, we could go on and on about it, but like I think that's great because I think that you've really nailed something that I think a lot of people overlook, and it's not till later on that they start to kind of see things a little bit differently and start to understand, like, if they want a certain result, it's not about dimming your light or whatever, it's about how the camera or the sensor is going to interpret it.
Right.
So that's awesome. That's so cool. And one thing you touched on just briefly before was like traveling with this industry especially. And I do think it is a pretty fascinating thing that most people overlook, and I think especially in your 20s, it is one of those things that you can really leverage, is the fact that you've got this global industry that once you kind of get your experience and you're able to leverage that, you are able to travel and take jobs. Like I've almost never been to New York just for a vacation. It was always, I'll tee up a job here, let that pay for the whole trip, and I'll stay a few extra weeks or whatever. But I think that is like something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, is that you can create this huge freedom with being able to take jobs in different places and get experience that you would never get otherwise. So, I think we're pretty fortunate to have that kind of industry that is global, and there is a need in, almost any country these days to be able to work out there.
Look, I mean, it's there's good and bad, I think, because if you're younger and you want to see the world and travel, and it's easier for you to move your base from one place to another. Obviously, when you get older, you have a family, you have kids, you get attached to a certain place. It's very hard to move. And I think one of the things that, people talk about it all the time. It's one of the hottest subjects in visual effects, is what all these tax incentives in Canada did to the industry in the U.S., how many Americans, U.S. people had to move over to Canada just because everything was migrating over there.
Right.
But now it is becoming more and more global, and you see in India there are more and more companies starting up there, and there are more and more companies starting up in China. And of course, there is in Europe. And I think it's all good. Like, I don't see it as threatening anything. A lot of people see it as a threat. But I do know that those shifts that are kind of forced on the artists because of those tax incentives, and they're kind of harsh in that way. On the other hand, me personally, I really enjoy going somewhere interesting for shooting different movies. For example, the James Gray movie, The Lost City of Z. We spent some time in Colombia, in a beautiful area, and also in Northern Ireland. I've never been there before. And Papillon, that is now playing in theaters, was shot in Serbia and Montenegro. And for me, it was just, a great opportunity to go over there. It's not just see a different place that you've never been to. It's also working with an international crew. People from all over the world, including a lot of locals, and to me, it's part of the joys of being a visual effects supervisor.
That's right.
I take it as a bonus. But the truth is that most of the movies we work on are being shot here in New York. Which explains why we work on them, because a lot of New York is a film shooting city, of course, and there's also tax incentives here, which make, if you do your whole post-production here in New York, you get some tax deductions. So a lot of productions shoot here and also do all the post here. And this is how we get a chunk of the work as a company. So I know New York very well just by standing, at a freezing temperatures or whatever for the whole day. I know all the places in New York, but we shot this here and we shot this here.
That's so cool. And just going back a bit, like for you, obviously going to Eon was a really good transition. Especially when you are kind of like taking the plunge, like especially if you were 40 years old, to kind of switch careers at that point, to kind of have that kind of a more, I would assume, stable solution, rather than, let's say that you went to work as a compositor in New York straight out of composing music to that obviously is going to be a bit more rolling the dice, because it can be a little bit more volatile. But for you going from Eon to ILM, like, what was that experience like, kind of moving into production and, your first few days there? I mean, is it a bit of a culture shock kind of walking into that environment?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was any kind of shock that you can imagine. Of course, moving to Singapore, which is so different.
Yep.
But
good food though.
yeah, I love Singapore. I miss it very much. I feel like it's another home of mine that I haven't been there, unfortunately, since we left in 2009.
Actually,
I really like.
Just to interrupt really quickly, but which is more brutal for summer, Manhattan or Singapore?
I think Singapore, you just get used to it because it's the same all year round. So you can't complain like here. But I think when it gets really hot, it gets much hotter here. And I think New York, yeah.
I describe Manhattan as a microwave, like, because like everyone I've ever known is like, come to New York, like summertime is so great, and yeah, every time it's like the only other place I can think of is Singapore where I've ever had to hide from the heat. I'm like halfway somewhere to where I want to go, and I'm like, I need to go underground just to escape this for a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a different kind of heat. I think when it gets really hot here, it's brutal, but it's only for a few days. It's never,
Yeah.
in Singapore, it's the whole year. I mean,
This is
Christmas
life.
is the same heat as it's the same.
Mm.
So it's different. Anyway, we were talking about ILM and the culture shock. Well, I think for me, the main culture shock was just the fact that I never worked in a corporation or any big company before. I was a musician, I was freelancer, and I working in theaters. So I used to be working with, a crew of about 4 people, director, designer, lighting designer, and the artists, the actors, of course. All this structure of a big company was very new to me and very strange and took some time to get used to. And also the different cultures. I mean, it was a cultural melting pot over there because they had the senior people were from California, from ILM, California. The artists were from all over the place, like from Europe and mostly from Asia and Southeast Asia, Japan, China. And of course, you see all these cultural differences, and which I think weren't very easy for ILM too at the beginning. Took them some time to, to figure out how to work things out with people who are so culturally different. To me, it was, again, another great school. And coming to New York is very diverse and culturally diverse. And my students at the School of Visual Arts are basically from all over the world. They're from Korea, from China, from Spain, I think it was a good preparation to working with that, and also a good school of how you work within an organization. I am not sure I love the big corporate organizations. I'm very happy that I work in a small company, and all companies in New York, VFX companies, are small. None of them is as large as, the big ones that you have. I think I generally prefer that because I think it's more intimate. But it was a nice experience to see how that works, the big, giant corporate company.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess, like, talking project-wise, like, Ironman, was that your first project?
Yeah, actually it was. My very first compositing shot in my life, honestly, was one, I don't know if you remember in the movie, but he starts building these thrusters or whatever, and he tries them at his own lab, and he kind of flies all over the place and falls and crashes.
One of the more memorable.
A couple of these shots were my first, and the interesting thing is that they were given to me. I had to, of course, paint out all the rigs that were holding him, but then they say, oh, you just need to add, like, smoke and flames coming out the thrusters, and there was no CG simulation for that. I was just like going through the library and just grabbing stuff that worked and added it there.
They have such an amazing stock library.
Oh, yeah. But this is something that, up to this day, I usually, when I work with our artists at Brainstorm, I usually try and keep things on the 2D side, just because, if you find the right element, it's going to look probably better than any CG simulation. And I hope I don't insult any of the people who do that, because I am always fascinated by simulations, but they are long and tedious and expensive. And what you get from using, real footage, elements that were shot and were done practically is that photoreal quality of something that's, is actually real and was shot by a camera.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like, my background is I basically come from more the simulation background, but as a supervisor, like, hands down, I'm always going to choose practical elements or something, shot in camera over anything else, because otherwise you are basically competing with you're trying to fight off the look being simulated before you can actually focus on the rest of it. So plus also just coming from the 90s, like, my whole philosophy was that 3D was so bad back then that you would be handling a pile of shit over to the compositor and they'd perform miracles to make your work look amazing. So, in general, it's just like all the magic is done in comp, and it's always going to be that way.
Look, I come from a from the comp side, but it's clear that CG has changed a lot in, let's say, the past 10, 15 years. What is possible now is stunning. It's amazing, the level of realism and complexity, especially in simulations, fluid and liquid simulations. And also because we have access to much better, faster computers, systems, and we can really do that. And I don't, it depends also on the context of where you work. I mean, our company, Brainstorm Digital, is relatively small, and most of the movies we do are not high budget movies, and they're definitely not visual effects movies in the sense that no one who goes to see, let's say, The Lost City of Z or Papillon or Boy Erased or Nerve or Hereditary is going there to see visual effects. And I mean, we did some very complex visual effects on The Wolf of Wall Street. Maybe the most complicated shot I ever had to deal with was done on The Wolf of Wall Street, and it's completely a movie that no one is expecting to see visual effects. So it means that whatever we do has to be absolutely invisible. And when you have to do that, you tend to go towards the 2D or using footage or photography and matte painting rather than 3D, because there's just something about working with real images that takes you already half the way there. But we've done a lot of, not any like the big companies, but we have to do CG. For example, on The Lost City of Z, there's a whole scene where they fall into the water in the river, in the river, and are attacked by piranhas. Obviously, that was all CG piranhas. But I think because we have very good compositors, very seasoned, that because most of the work we do is hacking. We get shots that don't work. We get stunts that don't work. They shot it and it's just not looking good or whatever. We do a lot of that. We help fix or hack around things that didn't quite work during shooting, or the director changed his mind and wants to change that. And the big shot on The Wolf of Wall Street was basically a shot of the tennis where the camera pulls out, and originally we were supposed to just extend the camera movement so that as we pull out, we see him playing tennis, and as we pull out, we realize that he's playing tennis in a prison, in a sort of a low security prison where he goes at the end of the movie. But then Scorsese, the director, didn't like the speed of the original camera move. That was a crane move, and he felt it's too slow.
Right.
So he wanted us to make it faster. Now, you can't just speed up the footage because then you're speeding up the actors, of course. So to change the camera movement in such a big move in a shot, we had to basically take apart the entire shot, roto out every element, the floor, the backgrounds, the tennis nets, everything, the poles, and the actors themselves, and reproject them on cards and design a CG camera that will move faster. There were so many other problems there because some of the actors were cut off by the edge of the frame, so you couldn't have them come in earlier into the shot because
you're re-choreographing the whole shot.
Yeah, and Robert Legato, the great visual effects supervisor. It was really an honor to work with him. He's one of those supervisors that really understand both the shooting side and the CG/comp side of things. So he totally understood that, and he did a special session of shooting new actors.
Oh, that's great.
On green screen, but he was so meticulous as to put, in front of them giant TV screens that showed them what the actors in front of them were doing in the original shot, the one that we're keeping, so that they can time their tennis playing to that. It worked out at the end, but it was a very big undertaking for basically just making a faster camera.
Yeah, it's so funny, those projects that you put your heart and soul into, and for you kind of know, the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it, but for everyone else, it looks like, it was shot on camera, and they don't understand the process and all the meticulous bits and pieces that went into it. But
yeah, and then we put out a nice reel, and it all looks like so easy when you put it on a reel. Everybody's like, "Oh, you guys, you just did that." But I take it as a compliment when people say, "Oh, that was visual effects," or "There were visual effects in that movie. I didn't notice."
It's like sorry, I was going to say, a lot of my friends who work at Weta in the character animation department, and every interview you see of Andy Serkis saying like about his performances, and everyone just assumes it. Performance capture is performance capture, and there's no keyframes involved. And
yes.
The amount of guys I know are like, I literally hand keyframed the entire shot, and
yes,
you got someone else taking credit for the whole thing.
Well, that's a totally different subject that I'm aware of. It's a big debate. But again, part of it is because visual effects is all new. It's a new industry. It's a new form of craft, and it keeps changing and evolving. And this whole kind of motion capture actor was something that Andy kind of invented in a way, or he was the first to become famous by doing just motion capture.
Absolutely.
And now there's this whole profession of motion capture artists, and how do you treat that, and how do you make people be aware that it's not just we capture their motion and then we just plug it in and it works.
There's not a one-click process.
Yeah. Well, nothing is a one-click process. A lot of times I'm on set and there is a shot and they would come to me and say, well, we can't remove that thing that in the background. Can you paint it out? So like paint out something, a lot of people think if it's a paint out shot, it must be easy. But there's a whole range of these types of works from truly easy to some shots that are incredibly difficult and complicated just to get something out of the image because there's so many things that go over it or because the camera is moving in a certain way. And, it's also my job as a supervisor to kind of try and explain and also help the VFX producers to set up a realistic budget for shots like this.
Mm-hmm.
Because the tendency is, if you don't really know the inner working of visual effects, is to say, okay, that's a green screen shot. So all green screen shots should cost this much or are going to take that much. And it's not true. It's definitely not true. And, we've had all kinds of green screen shots, and some are really easy and some are completely difficult. It also depends on the green screen itself or a lot of other variables or what you're going to put behind instead of the green screen. And this is, by the way, a reason why I wrote the book, because the book, The Filmmaker's Guide to Visual Effects, I wrote it for people who work with visual effects but do not do visual effects. Directors, producers, cinematographers, first ADs, even set designers, everyone who's working with visual effects, because I always felt that there is really there is a place for a book that explains how these things work so that people that work with visual effects can budget it, more accurately, can know what to expect, don't have too high of expectations or too low, basically to enrich, their world so they work with it. Because the truth is that still a lot of people, even in the film industry, think that visual effects is something that you do for, Marvel Comics movies or whatever, sci-fi movies or dinosaurs, not in your usual kind of low budget drama or whatever. And it's absolutely not true. Mm-hmm. It's a tool that you can use for anything you need. And it's just another filmmaking tool, just like editing or color grading.
That's good.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that book is that I did write it for filmmakers, but I realized that a lot of people that bought the book are actually visual effects artists. And I realized that a lot of them, especially the more junior ones, are kind of focused on one task or one craft. They do modeling and they don't really get a chance to see the whole picture. Something that we as visual effects supervisors have to. The entire picture of what this whole process of doing visual effects for movies really is and what it takes and how it looks from the other side, from the filmmaking side. And I realized that, it's also a good book for artists, for VFX artists.
Yeah, I think that, that's exactly what I was going to ask, because I'm not sure what your opinion is on this, but I do feel like no matter what area you are in as a visual effects artist, I think it's really important to not only learn the lay of the land, like the whole process from that bird's eye view, but in addition, I think that, let's say if you specialize in animation, I think it's just important to understand, the areas around that, like rigging and modeling, at least enough so that you can specialize in your area, but know the process around it. Like effects, I would say compositing and coding and lighting, would be the three around that one area. But the more that you understand those surrounding areas, the better that not only are you able to communicate to the people who are sending you assets, but let's say if your effects are going into comp, not only can you slap comp things and see how they're going to end up, but you can communicate to the compositor, hey, what elements do you need? And in the same way that if a compositor understands 3D, they're able to communicate more accurately, hey, can you give me a Z-depth pass? Can you do me this, this, and this? So the more that you understand where your stuff's coming from and where it's going, the better that you can serve everyone, as well as make sure that you're getting what you need as well.
Absolutely. I think that it goes for every kind of craft in visual effects. Even if you're a modeler,
Mhm.
If you know how things will look in a certain light, you will model them to look like that. You'll do the small bevels on certain edges to catch the light or catch the
Exactly.
highlight. It goes through the whole process. I don't, even people who do roto, roto is looked at, rotoscoping is looked at as like the simplest or the task, and you can easily grab a bunch of people from the street and teach them that in a few days, and they're roto artists. But it's not true, because you have to understand motion blur, and you have to know where to cut the line,
Mhm.
what to include and what not to include, because then, the only way to know that is to do some compositing and see what the compositor really needs. So it goes, I think it's very important. I think one of the problem is that a lot of bigger companies, they see themselves as spending money and time to train people into a certain craft, and they don't want to waste too much. So they want people to specialize in their own craft and be as good as they can in one craft, rather than spend it on like learning other things that they're not necessarily going to do. Some companies are like this. I really appreciate the ones that don't see it that way and give an overall training,
Mhm.
because it's important. And of course, if you want to become a supervisor,
You need to know everything.
you need to know everything, not be an expert in anything. But the fact that at the very beginning, I spent like half a year just teaching myself rigging,
Mhm.
and reading books about it, and playing with bones and joints and IK. I've never really been doing rigging since then, but now if I need to talk to a rigger, I know to speak his or her language, which
Mm.
is important for supervisors.
And that goes
And
back to what you were saying earlier, that in film and music and everything else, like you need to understand everyone else's language to be able to communicate fluently with them in terms of what you need from them.
communication is probably the most difficult thing in everything we do, not just in visual effect. I think it affects any kind of industry, but I see it very strongly in visual effects on all sides. Notes that come from production that are not necessarily clear can cause so much confusion.
Mhm.
All you need is one person that is, the supervisor on the other side is saying something, and that person, let's say coordinator, types it in really fast and missed out some half the sentence, and that gets sent to another supervisor in a company, and that guy is not necessarily understanding what they want. And then those artists are spending another week to tweak things and change them based on something that from the beginning was a misunderstood note, and then it
Yep.
all goes back to the director, and he's like, what did you do? It's not what I meant. And it's something that I'm spending a lot of time looking at and trying to see better ways to do it. And obviously, look, a lot of the shows that we work on, movies, are smaller movies, and I love working on those, because when I work on those, so I am in the capacity of being the visual effects supervisor, also the production VFX supervisor in a way, because I am the one who sits with the director, with the editor, and talk to them directly. And I think talking directly, and this is something I bring from theater, especially when you deal with creative issues, there is nothing that can replace that. Just sitting in the same room with the editor and the director and talking about a shot and the issues and the problems. But it doesn't always happen, especially not on big shows that are multi-vendor.
Mhm.
Because then you have a VFX supervisor and a team, usually, coordinators and producers sitting with production, and they're working with different companies, and that starts to become very, very complicated. Just managing all the back and forth that goes on, you need to use, software like Shotgun to put everything. You need to document everything, notate everything, and at the end, what you have is this monster industrial thing that kind of works, but a lot of times you're losing the direct connection, if you know what I mean.
Yep. Absolutely.
And it's a price you have to pay when you end up having 1,000 artists working on a movie, which nowadays I think it's even more than that on some of those Marvel movies. And you can't do them otherwise, because there's so much work that's been put in there, so many VFX shots, and they're so complicated. You have to work with different companies. And sometimes the work on these movies is amazing, sometimes it's less, and everyone can see that it's not always consistent. As much as you try, it becomes very hard to just relay creative decisions when there's so many steps in between.
Yeah,
But I don't know how to really make it better. It's difficult.
yeah, it's definitely an art form that's still growing. I mean, visual effects is still quite, premature in terms of it's still got a long way to go, but more importantly, it hasn't really been around that long. And that's why, when we talk about shooting things in camera or stock elements, I mean, you're getting that for free. You're not having to create things from scratch. And on top of that, the tools are always maturing as they need to in these other areas. And consistency is always going to be the biggest issue with films. Like, even on projects, there's plenty of projects where I've had to say, yeah, I worked on that project, but I didn't work on this sequence, just having to make it very clear. Yeah, it's always a battle. And I was curious, like, talking about your book, obviously, you've talked about like what inspired you to make it. I was curious, like, how long did it take you to write it? I'm more curious for myself because I'm always interested in the process. Some people, it's I guess you're so passionate, it kind of comes out naturally. You get obsessed and get in those trenches, but other people, it's more a labor of love you do in your spare time. So.
Yeah, look, I mean, I gave the publisher a deadline. I said I'll do it in a year. And that was so over-optimistic. I mean, I ended up finishing it in about a year and a half, which is not bad, but I realized that it's so much more difficult than I thought. I was really naive. First of all, because I have a daytime job. I'm a supervisor in a company, and I go there every day, or I go on set. A lot of the book I wrote during travels and on set in countries, because over there, sometimes you go, let's say, I went to Northern Ireland for shooting Lost City of Z. In the schedule, there were certain days where I was needed on set. There were other days when I wasn't needed on set, but I still had to stay there in the hotel. That was the perfect time to write the book or write parts of it. Also, airplanes. It's hard because when you have a job, and it's also hard because writing is hard. I didn't know how hard it is, because things that seem so clear to you when you think of them. Oh yeah, I know. When you try to put them in words, and explain them in a clear, simple way, it's not easy. You write, and then you erase it, and you write another time, and then you fix it, and then you go back.
Yeah, you take it for granted.
Iterative process. So the next book I'm going to write, I'm going to give myself more time. Absolutely, yes.
Good. What was the most challenging part of the process? I'm just curious because a lot of my friends who write books, table of contents for them is always the hardest part, whereas sometimes other people is the editorial, like the editing stage. Or for you, like, what was probably the most challenging part of it?
I can't really pinpoint about one challenging part. I know that, table of content is hard, especially when you do it at the preliminary stage. And the only advice I can give to someone who writes a book is write a preliminary table of content for your proposal, and to start with knowing that this is going to change as you go. It will change. There's no way to keep hold, but it's important to have it. And this is a difficult stage because that's where you're trying to kind of shape up something that up until now is just an idea or a bunch of ideas into a structure. And that's definitely not easy. So that's one hurdle. And then there were certain parts in the book that were very easy to me, like the whole descriptions of the different CG crafts, like modeling and texturing. Again, thinking that these are for people who don't necessarily understand the difference or don't know what UV mapping is. Explaining these was easier than, let's say, the chapter about camera movement and why it affects so much the complexity level of a shot, which a lot of directors or producers don't understand. It's hard. It's a hard concept to understand, parallax, and why is it so much harder, or why did you charge so much more on this shot than the other one? Well, because the way the camera moves really complicates a lot of things. So that was like a hard one. It was really hard for me to find a good way to explain it. And
why did we charge more? Because you took the hairband off the woman and put a fan in front of her. That's why.
But it sounds easy to explain, but you want to put it into a sort of a principle. Like, this is how you need to think of it. Look, I mean, here's the thing. Even talk about visual effects supervisors. I mean, they generally come from either one direction or the other. Either they came from behind the camera as, second unit directors or cinematographers or camera crew, or they came from the CG world or compositing world, from the actual, working it. And whichever, it doesn't matter what your origins are. If you want to be a good supervisor, you have to learn the other side, because, if you're on set, and I obviously came from the CG work part into the set, and it took me some time to realize how things work on the set and how different they are from working in a VFX facility. And especially what you mentioned, before is the fact that there is no going back. There is no control Z when you shoot something. There's 200 people standing there waiting for you to take a decision. And once you took that decision, it's a go, and that's it. That's the shot. Unless you go and do reshoots, which are going to cost a lot of money, of course. And so, that's just understanding the other person's craft again from it, knowing why you're doing it a certain way, but also, let's say you're a VFX supervisor that your background is in cinematography. When you look at a shot and you're trying to figure out what would be the easiest, best way to do it for the visual effects people, and also to make it cheaper, less expensive, you have to think from a compositor or an animator or point of view. You have to see the issues in the shot on the set through that point of view. And the other way around, if you know a lot about compositing and CG, and you come on set and you do not understand the needs and the restrictions of the cinematographer, the camera operator, the lighters, and you're in trouble too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, at least from CG, like the way I see it, if you were to map out like a career of a CG artist ending up, let's say, in a VFX super role, and again, even visual effects supervising, there isn't just one type. It's kind of like a producer or anyone else. Like you are going to, depending on who you're working with, whether you're production side, what the type of work that you're typically doing is, all of these things are factors. But I do think it's interesting for CG that I always recommend people start out as a generalist. It's kind of like what we talked about, learning the lay of the land, understanding all the mechanics of everything, but eventually you want to specialize to, not only help you be able to get work and define yourself, but to really kind of hone in on one area and get really good at that. But what I find interesting is you are going to get to a certain point where you're probably going to move more into a supervisor role. And at some point, you'll probably want to become a CG generalist. And that's, to me, is kind of interesting because going from generalist to specialist, you kind of revert. You need to relearn the entire department or all the studio's areas to at least have an understanding of, okay, like if I'm coming from lighting, well, I still need to know how a rigger or animator, all these other people, like what their jobs are. So that way I can manage my department, my studio better. But so being a CG supervisor, you're kind of relearning everything all over again, at least that 10% to allow you to do your job. But eventually when you start going to more of a VFX super role, instead of looking back, you're more looking forward, because you're right. Like if you are coming from the CG perspective, then you need to start bridging over into understanding cameras, lighting, more all the politics of being on set, and again, it's kind of a progression from there. But you're right. Like if it's coming from more of, let's say you're a DP or something like that, and you eventually moved into that role of VFX soup, understanding the visual effects side of things, like that's in a way a lot more difficult because you don't have that history in that area. You're having to try and get access to it, understand it all without really ever having any hands-on experience, which I assume in some ways can be kind of frustrating or intimidating too.
Definitely, and I've met or worked with supervisors who are more on the onset type and do lack experience. The good ones just have an understanding. You don't have to know how to tweak a shader in Arnold to be able to understand the process. Mm-hmm. And again, that's the reason I wrote the book, trying to give you need to understand, the requirements and the needs in a more general way. But I do agree that it's difficult to learn all this without having any hands-on experience.
Definitely.
So, I just see it like this, I mean, at the bottom line for me is that you keep learning all the time. I think, the moment I stop learning, it's probably the moment I need to retire or go to some tropical island. Well, not tropical because I don't like heat. Go on some mountain and I don't know. The feeling is, for me, it's the essence of everything. And it's amazing to me every day how much I learn. Anything, even, some kind of political thing on set or something with production is something you learn from. Working with people you really did not enjoy working with, and and I've had these experiences. Some of them were horrific. It's a learning experience. You learn from anything, and I like to just still learn stuff. Like right this weekend, I was going and looking into Arnold 3 and the new shaders and the car paint shader that I was curious about and never had time to look at. And it's not really necessary for the job I'm doing right now to understand, the clear coat on on a car paint shader, but it's some information that is there that adds to it. And this is the thing I'm always trying to explain to my students. There is no point where you just know stuff.
Yeah.
There's no such point. And for becoming VFX supervisor is just, I think the main importance is to have curiosity. You are curious about what other people in the company are doing, what other artists are doing. You're curious about how things are going on the production side. You're even curious about budgeting. Like I don't love budgeting. I don't like Excel sheets. They give me a headache looking at them. I'm not good with money, not on a personal level but this is part of my job too. To sit with the VFX producer and to look at the different shots and try and budget them and give a sense of how difficult they are, how many days, how many artists, and so forth. So you have to have at least a little bit of curiosity towards that area too, towards areas that you're not really interested in. And I think that curiosity and the will to keep learning all the time are important in everything in life, I guess, but they're definitely important if you want to be a supervisor.
No, that's great. That's so cool. And I guess a couple more questions I have. One was actually you mentioning your new book. Are you going to keep it a secret for now, or do you want to mention what it's about?
It's in very early stages right now. It's got to go through the whole proposal stage with the publisher and through initial reviews. So at this point, no, I cannot say. It's not a big secret. Obviously, it's going to be about the stuff that we're talking about. And in a way, it's going to be not a continuation, but it's going to take over from my first book and go deeper into certain areas. And I'll be happy to talk about it more when it becomes official and it's on the way. Yes.
Cool. No, I can't wait. And one or two other questions I had was, I guess, and this is such a broad question, but having that experience at SVA and with your career as well, I mean, do you have any advice for artists starting out, to make the most in the early years of their career?
Well, yeah, it's hard. It's hard because when you go to school like SVA or any other art school, you're being pampered. The teachers are there for you. They're trying their best to help you out. No, but obviously, when you do the first step out into the world, it can be daunting and overwhelming because once it becomes work, people are not really interested in you. They're just interested in what you do for them, and it's all about getting paid and money, and it can be very stressful. One thing that I feel, especially artists or students here in New York, don't really have a clear idea of the layout of companies here in New York City, as opposed to, they think in their mind ILM or Weta or big companies, and sometimes ignore the different options that you have. I tell them to go try out as much as they can and decide for themselves what they like to do. Hopefully you want to do what you like and not what you think your parents or your surroundings want you to do. Even if you studied 4 years at a art college like School of Visual Art and you end up trying the work and realize that you don't really like it, it's fine. I mean, these people are very, very young. And that's why I tell them my own story where I started with this whole thing very late in my life, so that they know that it's never too late and they still have the opportunity to go and switch. I think it's very important just to think that you have, you can do whatever you want. You can switch and you can try this and try that, and you don't have to settle into a path at such a age of 20 or 21. And then, of course, to be aware of your surroundings and work in a place that you enjoy working. And if you don't enjoy working there or you're not being treated well, leave. I think it will make our industry better if people just left places that mistreated them. It's a difficult industry. The owners of companies are under a lot of pressure. It's very competitive, and you're working on movies, which are completely, it's a random thing working on a movie. It's not, anything can happen at any time. The director can change their mind. In all that pressure, it's still very important to give the artists a good environment, and I think it's up to the artists. And that's what I tell my students, if you don't like a place because you're not being treated well, just quit. And if other people will quit, then that place is going to stop not treating people well and is going to start treating them well or shut down.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, because it definitely is one of those industries that, because money is definitely kind of shifting at the moment. Like budgets are shrinking, and there's a lot of people coming into the industry. Work's going to Vancouver. There's a lot of different moving parts, but because of that, like I have had many discussions with artists who are like, the studios, they're the enemy and they're the bad guys, and I've had to say so many times that, like, if anything, a lot of visual effects studios are actually the ones who are kind of the heroes in a lot of ways, just because they're the ones taking the risk. Like if a project goes over budget or anything else, like, what's the worst that could happen to you? You maybe don't get paid for a little bit longer or whatever, but studios can shut down, they can get sued, employees can sue them. Like, there's so many different things. So in a lot of ways, it's more the studios are reacting to all the other bits that are moving around. And you're right, there's going to be some places that are able to manage themselves better, and then there's other places that aren't managing things, or they see artists as just another entry on a spreadsheet. And because of that, the politics can get into it, and some places are enjoyable, other places aren't. And I think that unless people are able to stand up for themselves, like, you're kind of training certain bad employers to kind of see it as being okay. Like, yes, I'll work all night long for a day rate, which does happen, and then they see it like, well, these people did it without any repercussions, so therefore it's okay. So being able to kind of stand up for yourself, I think, does kind of allow it to kind of you to put a stop to certain bad behavior.
Yeah, I definitely I agree, and I definitely agree with what you said about studios being under a lot of pressure. It's a very difficult industry. I see it every day. I see the problems, the issues, and there is a lot of pressure on owners. But by the way, a behavior that is not appropriate does not have to be from a big boss. It could be from the guy next to you, treating you like, it's really a matter of, like you said, it's these young junior people who still feel, when you first come into a company, you're young, you're a junior, you just started, everything looks kind of scary and imposing. But if you remember that you still can decide for yourself, and you can still identify improper behavior from your bosses or your co-workers, and you have the choice. You're not bound to this place by any chains. I think it will make our industry better. Unfortunately, we don't have union. We don't have a union.
Yeah.
There is no one who can put, some kind of borderlines to what things are allowed and which things are not allowed. Because we don't have a union, it depends on the artists. And I see it as a good thing for company owners too. I don't think that makes them enemies of the company owners. Quite the opposite. And I do think that when look, I'm not perfect, and I'm a supervisor, and many times I've found myself, being not nice to a person because I was frustrated or upset or was under pressure to deliver. It's natural, but I can say at least that I'm trying my best to treat the artists with as much respect as I can. And I just think that if anyone would do that, it will make the industry better and also function better. The companies would function better.
No, that's great. That's really cool. And no, I want to thank you again for taking the time to chat. This has been really cool. I'm curious too, like, for anyone who wants to go and find out more about you, obviously I'm going to leave links to everything in the show notes, but where can people go to track you down?
Well, there is my own site, which I admit I don't I don't always update or take care of. It's just kind of lying there, but you can still see the reels that we produce at Brainstorm that all show my work as a supervisor, and I'm proud of my team and the work we do. So that's the main place to go. There is also a little bit about my book there, and a link to the book on Amazon, where there's some more information. And there, that's about it. I think that's the best place to get information. And LinkedIn, of course. I'm happy to connect with anyone from the industry and so forth.
That's great. In fact, I'm going to add you right now because I actually had you up on my screen. No, it's just been great, man. I appreciate you taking the time. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, for me too. It was great. Thank you so much.
Okay, I want to thank Eran for taking the time to chat. I found this episode to be really insightful, and a lot of really great knowledge has been dropped along the way, so I think this was really fun. That being said, I'll be back next week. I'm going to be chatting with Jeannie Santos, who's a animation supervisor at Pixar, also worked at ILM, worked on a lot of amazing stuff. We talk about everything from working on Toy Story 2 and everything back in the day. Her job interview at Pixar with Steve Jobs, and so much more. So lots of really great insights. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you want to check out the show notes, go to alanmckay.com/172. If you get a moment, what I would really love and be so grateful for is if you can share this episode around. If you're on Instagram, just take a screenshot on your phone of this episode and post it there. Tag me in it, and that way I'd love to be able to see it. Otherwise, if you want to share it on Facebook or LinkedIn, wherever you like. Again, I'm always grateful for this, and it would mean the world to me. Thank you, and I'll be back next episode with Jeannie Santos. Until then, rock on.